U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Chinese President Xi Jinping during a high-stakes trip to Beijing. The U.S.'s top diplomat says that both sides agreed to, quote, stabilize ties. CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan is traveling with the Secretary of State and spoke with him in Beijing. Margaret?
Caitlin, Secretary Blinken came to Beijing with the intent of diffusing the risk of a potential military conflict. And while there were no major breakthroughs, U.S. diplomats left with a sense of progress that at least now the two superpowers are talking. And before leaving Beijing, Secretary Blinken sat down with me and went through a number of the issues between the two countries, including the flow of fentanyl from here in China across the U.S. border, as well as spying, that listening post in Cuba. Take a listen. Your message has consistently been that you are here to open up lines of communication to avoid a military clash. But you just said China did not agree to open that military to military line of talks. Did Xi Jinping just say no?
It's a work in progress. This is something that we need to do in the interests of both of our countries. That is, not only to establish and reestablish and strengthen lines of communication across our government, which we have done, starting with this trip, and I believe visits to follow by a number of my colleagues, and then Chinese officials coming to the United States. Hugely important if we're going to responsibly manage the relationship, if we're going to communicate clearly and try to avoid the competition that we have veering into conflict. But an aspect of that that really is important is military to military. Mm-hmm. We don't have an agreement on that yet. It's something we're going to keep working. I made very clear to our Chinese counterparts the importance that we attach to that, something that is also profoundly in their interest, because again, we both agree that we want to, at the very least, make sure that we don't inadvertently have a conflict because of miscommunication, because of misunderstanding.
So Xi Jinping didn't say absolutely not. It was just not a commitment.
This is a work in progress. We're working on it.
Will the defense chiefs at least talk to each other?
Well, again, to be seen. We've made clear that we think that's important, more than important, imperative. I think the Chinese understand very well, because I made very clear where we're coming from on this, and we'll keep working it.
During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had that hotline. Is that the kind of thing you're imagining? How would this kind of communication work?
It's less a hotline and more regular engagement, regular communication, so that they understand what we're doing and not doing. We understand what they're doing and not doing. We have greater clarity on each other's intent in different places. And in particular, when we have incidents like the incidents that we just had a couple of weeks ago, with them driving their boats much too close to ours, or their planes flying in very dangerous ways near ours, that we have a channel established that we can go to deal with the problem.
But that architecture just doesn't exist right now.
Well, we of course have many ways to communicate with the Chinese government. It's exactly what we're doing, and we're seeing that now pick up, in part as a result of this trip. It's fundamentally in our interest to do that. But one aspect that remains is the military to military, and we'll keep pressing it.
The other thing that you really emphasized was the need to talk about fentanyl, which is killing Americans.
That's right.
Do you believe that the Chinese state can really turn that up and turn that down?
Yes. Yes. We need to see much greater cooperation when it comes to fentanyl. We've seen some of that in the past. In fact, a few years ago, China actually scheduled fentanyl, put it on a prohibited list. And one result of that was that actually manufactured fentanyl that had been coming to the United States from China, that pretty much went to zero. What's happened since, though, is that the chemicals that can be used to make fentanyl, the so-called precursors, those have been moving liberally primarily to Mexico, where it gets turned into fentanyl and then winds up in the United States. So part of the challenge is making sure that chemical manufacturers that are producing these precursors in China, and then in some cases inadvertently sending it to the wrong people in Mexico or other places, sometimes intentionally, deliberately, that's what's got to stop. I made very clear to China that this is an area where we want and need to see real cooperation. As you said, this is a crisis for us. The #1 killer of Americans aged 18 to 49, fentanyl. So the best way to deal effectively with this problem across the board, we're working, of course, on dealing with demand in the United States. We're dealing with law enforcement with Mexico. We're dealing with putting technology on our borders to detect fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. But we also want to go to the source, and that is these precursor chemicals. I believe this is an area where the United States and China can and must work together. It's not about pointing fingers. It's simply finding a way to cooperate.
I've had lawmakers in the U.S. say that this is done intentionally by the Chinese state. Do you believe that?
So all I can tell you is this. We've seen cooperation from them in the past, and that's made a difference. That halted more or less over the last few years. They have issues that they've raised to try to explain why they're not doing as much as they can.
Did you raise the listening post in Cuba that was recently disclosed and we've talked about?
I did. I'm not going to characterize their response, but I told them that this is a serious concern for us. And
how widespread is this in Latin?
So we've been taking steps over the past couple of years, diplomatically, wherever we've seen China trying to create that kind of presence. We've been in there pushing back against it, and we've had some success in doing that. This is nothing new, but it is something of real concern. I was very clear about our concerns with China, but regardless of that, we've been going around to various places where we see this kind of activity, trying to put a stop to it.
Did you get any commitment on those 3 wrongfully detained Americans?
We have a commitment to continue to work hard on resolving these cases, and for me, that's right up there.
From the Chinese government?
Yes. From me, that is job number 1 when it comes to looking out for the security and the safety of Americans abroad, and notably those who are being arbitrarily detained.
Mark Swedan's health, in particular, is a worry. His mother has spoken to CBS and other news organizations.
Yes, I'm deeply concerned about that, and that's exactly why I not only raised but talked some length about the individual cases of the detained Americans.
Are we in a place, though, as 2 governments where you're negotiating or even talking about a prisoner release, or is this just...
Yes, we are.
You are?
We are.
And there's progress?
Again, I don't want to get into the details, but we are very actively talking about that.
Well, that would certainly be a breakthrough in the relationship to bring those Americans home.
It would, regardless of anything else, be a very important and positive development, and we're working it intensely.
All of this carefully orchestrated diplomacy happens against the backdrop of a Congress that is putting political pressure on the president to take a harder lined stance. So that's political risk is just one of the many other factors that needs to be balanced here. And this is a very challenging relationship. All of the diplomacy that may happen in the coming weeks and months with other high-level visits like the Treasury Secretary who is expected to come to Beijing soon, it may all ultimately be building up to a face-to-face between President Biden and President Xi. Secretary Blinken told me that could indeed happen as soon as this fall. Caitlin?
A fascinating and important interview. Margaret Brennan, thank you.